As we begin, for those who may be visiting or those who don't remember what we talked about the last few weeks, where are we at in the story of Acts? What's going on right now?
Paul's on his way to Caesar.
All right, Paul's on his way to Caesar. And why is Paul on his way to Caesar?
He appealed to Caesar.
He appealed, right? And so over the last 4 chapters that we looked at, Paul was on trial 4 different times. He was on trial in front of the Jews in Jerusalem. The next chapter, he's on trial before Felix. The next chapter, he's on trial before Festus. The next chapter, he's on trial in front of who? Agrippa, right? And so 4 chapters in a row, he's on trial 4 different times, but he had appealed to Caesar after seeing Festus, trial number 3. Each time he has a trial before these individuals, what do they have the conclusion with? Well, besides the Jews who decided that he should die, like the 3 non-Jewish, even though Agrippa himself claims to be a Jew, before the actual civil Roman officials, what's the final verdict for Paul? He's innocent, right? He's innocent. And so, because Paul is a Roman citizen, like Miss Charlotte said, he has the ability to appeal to Caesar. Not everybody had that benefit, but Paul did. He couldn't be unjustly beaten or unjustly killed. As a Roman citizen, those things protected him. And so he appeals to Caesar, and that's where he goes. And so if you remember the last chapter, he's appealed to Caesar you'll go. And that gets us to Acts chapter 27. And then we start this journey where Paul is trying to get to Rome. And so let's go ahead and let's begin. Let's read verses 1 through 8 and talk about Paul's travels there. Verses 1 through 8. And so, when it was decided that we should set sail for Italy, they delivered Paul and some other prisoners to a centurion of the Augustan cohort named Julius. And embarking in a ship of the Adramyttium, which was about to set sail to the ports along the coast of Asia, we put to sea, and accompanied by Aristarchus, a Macedonian from Thessalonica, the next day we put in at Sidon, and Julius treated Paul kindly and gave him leave to go to his friends and be cared for. And putting out to sea from there, we sailed under the lee of Cyprus, and because the winds were against us. And when we had sailed across the open sea along the coast of Cilicia and Pamphylia, we came to Myra and Lucia. Then the centurion found a ship of Alexandria sailing for Italy and put us on board. We sailed slowly for a number of days and arrived with difficulty at Cnidus, and the wind did not allow us to go further, and we sailed under the lee of Crete off Salmon, and coasting along with great difficulty, we came to a place called Fair Havens, near which was the city of Lasea. And so maybe you know of New Lasea, Old Lasea congregations on the way to Columbia. This is where Lasea comes from. And so here in verses 1 through 8, we can see that there's very difficult travels. And so they're under the charge of a centurion named Julius of the Augustan cohort. There's only one other centurion that is named in the Bible, and who is that? Cornelius, right? Of what cohort? The Italian cohort, right? So this one's Augustan, and Cornelius was the Italian cohort. And so Cornelius is spoken about very favorably because he's the first Gentile convert in Acts chapter 10. And here Julius is seen to be painted in pretty positive lights as well. And so traveling with the Apostle Paul is Aristarchus, who is mentioned in Acts 19:29 and Acts 20 verse 4. He's the one who is beaten in Ephesus. We don't know exactly what happens, but it's possible that he was actually against Paul, was beaten, and then converted sometime later. He became a traveling companion of Paul. He's mentioned as a fellow prisoner in 2 of Paul's epistles, Colossians 4:10 and also Philippians 24. And so we don't really know if Aristarchus is also in prison with Paul, and Paul is just the one that the narrative is about because obviously he's Paul, or if he is in prison later on with Paul. But it is quite interesting that he is mentioned as a fellow prisoner. Also, somebody else is with this traveling group. Who is that? Luke, right? And so we can tell from Acts that whenever the we sections are there, that Luke is with them. There are times, sometimes for 5 or 6 years, that Luke is not with Paul and the we sections aren't there. But here it picks back up. Now, we haven't seen this section since Acts 21:28. And so we've gone 6 chapters since Luke has been with Paul. We're not told when Luke got with him, what time during that 2-year imprisonment it was, but evidently Luke and Aristarchus are with Paul, and they are on the ship to go to Italy as well. And Julius, does he treat Paul unfairly or bitterly? How does he treat Paul? Kindly. What does he do?
Go to visit his friend.
Yeah, think about this for a second. You're a centurion, right? If a prisoner escapes under your watch, you receive the condemnation of that prisoner. Now, Paul's a weird case because what has Paul done wrong? Nothing. I mean, that's the problem. That's why he's on trial 3 times in Caesarea, because every time it's like, we're going to send him to Caesar to stand trial, and he's not really accused of any breaking the law. And so eventually Paul's going to be let go under this charge. And so Julius treats him kindly. I mean, if you were a warden, would you allow your prisoner to leave with his buddies to go seek treatment or care?
Not under Roman rule.
I wouldn't. But does Julius? He does, right? And so Julius thinks very favorably of Paul and trusts him in a way that would be very difficult for me to trust someone who is a prisoner. And so Paul's being transported with other prisoners. We can see this here in this text. And we can see here that they give leave in Sidon to visit friends. More than likely these are Christians. Luke 12:4 and 3 John 15 talks about Christians in this area. And so some have theorized that Paul may have received medical treatment, seeing these friends, or maybe he just went to be encouraged. We just don't know. But one thing that we are for sure of is that Julius treats Paul in an uncharacteristic fashion of a slave or as someone who is in chains in the ancient world. Now, what does the text tell us about their travel so far? Slow, right? I mean, in the ancient world, these were not open water vessels. In the ancient world, they traveled, less than a few miles from the shoreline. They would get away from the reefs and the barriers and stuff, but literally, most of the time, they would like to sail where they could actually see land the entire time, because these weren't really open water vessels. And so they're traveling around the coast of Asia Minor, and they're not going very fast. The winds aren't favorable. There's no steam engines, there's no gas engines, and so you're kind of at mercy at the wind. And so the centurion had commanded a grain ship from Alexandria, Egypt. Now, we had talked about this in our Genesis class, at how Egypt was the breadbasket of the ancient world. The average yield in Egypt with wheat was 15 to 20 times that of the rest of the Mediterranean world. Imagine that for a second. Okay, my dad has several hundred acres of corn right now. Corn's going to, let's just use 200. 200's a good year, right? Normally between 180 and 200, but let's just use 200 for round number. Okay, 200 bushels an acre of corn. Okay, average, pretty standard average. Imagine there being a place in the world where you get 15 to 20 times that much in an acre. That is insane. That's Egypt, right, in the ancient world. And so without Egypt, Rome could not survive. Why? No food, right? Some of the most violent uprisings in Rome during the empire is because they have issues getting food from Egypt to Rome. And so he commandeers a ship going to Rome from Alexandria carrying grain. They put the men on there. There's 276 in all, we're told, and they set off. This is a map of the travels that we're going to talk about in this chapter. As you can see here, they leave Caesarea, and this is the route that they take. And so they commandeer a grain ship, and they set back off on their way. And so they're leaving Crete, if you will. Yes?
This travel to Rome would make a really good movie.
It'd be great. If I had a couple $100 million, we can make it happen. So, if you know somebody, Brother Austin, let me know. I think The Judges would be a great movie. Like somebody of course you got like the 1960s Technicolor, like Samson and stuff like that, but like with Gideon or somebody, like that would be a good movie. Yes. Any other questions or comments? All right, and so here you can see the travels here. They're trying to get to Rome, and then Paul gives a warning in verses 9 through 20. Since much time had passed and the voyage was now dangerous because of even the fast that already was over, Paul advised them, saying, Sirs, I perceive that the voyage will be both an injury and much loss, not only to the cargo and the ship, but also to our lives. But the centurion paid more attention to the pilot and the owner of the ship than to what Paul had said. And because the harbor was not suitable to spend the winter in, the majority decided to put out to sea from there on the chance that somehow they could reach Phoenix, a harbor of Crete facing both southwest and northwest, then spend the winter there. Now, when the south wind blew gently, supposing that they had obtained their purpose, they weighed anchor and set sail along Crete close to the shore. But soon a tempestuous wind called the nor'easter struck down the land, and when the ship was caught and could not face the wind, we gave in to and were driven along. Running under the lee of a small island called Calda, we managed with difficulty to secure the ship's boat after hoisting it up and its used supports to undergird the ship. Then, fearing that they would run aground on this Syrtis, they lowered the gear, and thus they were driven along. Since we were violently storm-tossed and began the next day to jettison the cargo, on the third day they threw the ship's tackle overboard with their own hands. When neither sun nor stars appeared for many days, and no small tempest lay on us, all hope of our being saved was at last abandoned. And so Paul gives a warning. And what is Paul's warning here? The centurion.
Not to leave the ship.
Yeah, we need to stay here, guys. It's too late. It's too late to set sail. Now, in the ancient world, this was known. It was codified, if you will, that after September the 14th, sailing was ill-advised. You really shouldn't if you don't have to. After September the 14th. Paul tells us the fast had already passed. The fast normally falls between the last week of September or the first week and a half of October. So are we after September the 14th? Yes. In fact, we're a good little distance past September the 14th. Sailing in the ancient world is ill-advised. Don't do it unless you necessarily have to. Paul's saying let's not do it. In fact, in the Roman world, sailing after November the 11th was illegal. It was actually illegal to sail after November the 11th until March because the seas were just too rough. And so time's getting on the short end. Paul says, guys, it's not the right time for us to sail. We should just cut our losses and winter here, in this town. But the text tells us they decide, the owner and the pilot decide not to. Why? Why risk it? There's got to be a reason. Why not just do what Paul says here? They're not just trying to be ornery. All right? This town is not suitable for wintering. So either the harbor is not in a good position because of the storms and leaves the ship vulnerable, or perhaps there's not enough food in the city to sustain a ship with 275 men for lodging or for food. So they decide, no, there's a Phoenix, which is a better port, and it's not super far away. The weather's nice. The wind's to our backs. If we leave, it shouldn't take us very long to get there. So let's just go. And so it's all right, let's do this. Paul doesn't, but the centurion and the pilot and the owner say, it's a little bit late, but the weather's not too bad. Let's just go ahead and go. So they get on the water, and as soon as they get out there, the Greek word is where we get our English word typhoon hits. A nor'easter, right? Coming out of the northeast. And so the ship is completely driven. They have to actually take ropes and tie it around the bottom of the ship to make sure that it is give an extra layer of support. They're afraid of the ship just breaking up because of the actual force of the winds and the seas. And so they get scared, and what do? They throw the cargo overboard, right? And so they're very afraid because they're afraid of being driven to the Syrtis off the Libyan coast in verse 17. This was known as the quicksands to the Romans, which wasn't actually quicksand like we would think about it, but the ship would get stuck in the sandbars and actually sink because of the changing sands, because of the ocean currents. This was the ancient world's Bermuda Triangle, okay? And so it's just a place that sailors did not want to go because oftentimes the ship would wreck and the sailors would die. And so they throw as much as they can overboard because they got to make the ship lighter to help fight against the winds. And so after 2 weeks, right, all hope is lost. I mean, they just absolutely I mean, they haven't seen the sun and stars. They navigate primarily on the oceans by staying where they can see actual land. That's gone. The stars they could use to do some crude navigation with, they can't see. They don't know where they're at. And so all hope is lost. And so I could not imagine being on a small ship in the ancient world and this being the conditions. I mean, could you?
2 weeks.
For 2 weeks. I mean, I once took a boat from Cozumel to mainland Mexico, which was like 30 minutes, and I thought I was going to be sick. And it was, I mean, and for most people, it'd been like, that was nothing. Like, what are you talking about? You know, like, I could not imagine being on a boat like this. I mean, just absolutely wild. This is what the boat looks like. This is not an actual picture of Paul on the boat, but this is what a cargo ship in the first century Rome looked like. And so without a shadow of a doubt, this is pretty much exactly what the boat looked like that Paul was going to be on. And so 276 men stuck on a boat this size for 2 weeks with limited food, right? With limited everything, right? No Wi-Fi, anything. And so, like, this is terrible. And so if you remember what it was like to fly before Wi-Fi, you can sympathize with that. And so just absolutely atrocious conditions. So let's go ahead and let's read verses 21 through 26. And since they had been without food for a long time, Paul stood up among them and said, "Men, you should have listened to me and not set sail from Crete and incurred this injury and loss. Yet now I urge you to take heart, for there will be no loss of life among you, but only of the ship. For this very night there stood before me an angel of the God whom I belong and whom I worship." And he said, "Do not be afraid, Paul. You must stand before Caesar. And behold, God has granted to you all those who sail with you. So take heart, men, for I have faith in God that it will be exactly as I've been told, but we must run aground on some island." And so Paul stands up after they've lost hope, and he says, "Men, you should take something, you should eat." But also he gives a little gentle what?
Told you so.
I told you so. Yeah, he stands up and says, "Don't know if a lot's happened the last 2 weeks, guys, but if you remember correctly, I actually told you not to go on the trip." I don't think this is exactly Paul trying to be trying to be rude or something like that. I think what Paul was saying is, I told you not to go last time. You didn't listen to me. Listen to me now, because I have received a message. He says, the God who I worship and whom I serve, right, has sent a messenger to tell me. He told me 4 things. There's 4 things we get from what the angel has told him. Number 1, that he's going to stand before Caesar. So Paul ain't down on the ship. Number 2, everyone's going to survive. So God says, not only is Paul going to be saved, but everybody on the ship is going to be saved as well. And so I think, ironically, Christians, Paul was a blessing to those he was around, literally, in their lives. We should be a blessing too. People's lives should be better because we're there. 3, the ship will be lost. The ship's going to be destroyed. So we're going to be saved. The ship's going to be lost. We're going to run aground on an island. And so the angel tells them these 4 things. And if you look, the only island in between the coast of Sicily and North Africa is a very, very small island called Malta. And so when you think about the needle in the haystack for the winds to push this ship, and it just so happens to get to an island named Malta, Paul says this is divine. This is a divine act. This isn't chance. This ship just isn't going to be tossed to and fro by ocean currents for 2 weeks and just so happened to land up in a harbor in the only island between Sicily and North Africa. And so this is important. All right. So any questions so far on what we've talked about? Any comments? Pretty straightforward stuff. So let's read verses 27 through 38. When the 14th night had come, we were being driven across the Adriatic Sea, and about midnight the sailors suspected that they were nearing land. So they took a sounding and found 20 fathoms. A little further they took a sounding, and again 15 fathoms. And fearing that we might run the rocks, they let down 4 anchors from the stern and prayed for day to come. And as the sailors were seeking to escape from the ship and had lowered the ship's boat into the sea, under pretense of laying out the anchors from the bow, Paul said to the centurion and the soldiers, "Unless unless these men stay in the ship, you cannot be saved. Then the soldiers cut away the ropes of the ship's boat and let it go. And as day was about to dawn, Paul urged them to take some food, saying, today is the 14th day that you have continued in suspense and without food, having taken nothing. Therefore I urge you to take some food, for it will give you strength, for not a hair on the head of any of you will be harmed. And when he had said these things, he took bread, and giving thanks to God in the presence of all, he broke it and began to eat. And they were all encouraged and ate some food themselves, and we were in all 276 persons in the ship. And when they had eaten enough, they lightened the ship, throwing out the wheat into the sea. So a fathom is used by sailors to indicate how deep the water is. A fathom is the length of the wingspan of a man. So about 6 feet. So about 6 feet is the length of a fathom. And so at 20 fathoms, the water is 120 feet deep. And so not very deep for the ocean. And so 120 feet deep. Then they take another sounding, and now it's 90 feet deep. And so this indicates that they are about somewhere between half a mile to a mile away from shore. And so it's the nighttime, they probably can't see shore, but they're only half a mile to a mile away. And so they drop 4 anchors. They don't want to run the boat and crash the boat. But what did Paul already tell them? The boat's going to be lost anyways. But anyways, so they get scared and they drop the anchors. Because who wants to be in the middle of the ocean in the night, right? So they drop the anchors. While they're waiting, the sailors, this is important. Not everybody on the ship's a sailor. You got soldiers, you got prisoners, you got people to help lift the cargo, you got slaves, right? But the sailors see land, and what do? Yeah, they take the lifeboat, right? And they lower it down the sides, and they're about to leave, right? Every man for himself. Like, you guys take care of your own necks. And so Paul sees this, and what does Paul tell the centurion?
If they leave, they'll die.
Yeah, they leave, they'll die. Now this is really interesting. And so what does the centurion do? He cuts the ropes, right? The boat floats away. And so, where everybody's on the same team, right? We get this ship to the shore or we don't. But one of the interesting things is that what Paul, and I'll go back to Ms. Holton said, Paul told them that unless the sailors stay on the ship, they will not be saved. Had God not promised to save the entire ship? So was Paul lying?
His instructions.
God had promised to save the ship, but was there instructions and stipulations attached to that salvation? Yeah, stay with the ship, right? And so did God send his son to the world to die for the world's sins? Yes, John 3:16 tells us that, right? And so, but does that mean that we don't have anything to do? No. And so I think about the parallels between this story and with salvation of man, right? We owed a debt that we couldn't pay, right? Christ paid a debt he didn't owe. But at the same time, there are still stipulations for us accessing and receiving that salvation. Yes, there are many people in the religious world today that will say, well, of course not. You don't have to do anything, right? But if you look at, I think when you look at this in Acts 27 and you compare side by side the fact that yes, God had promised to save them if they stayed with the ship, right? God has promised to save us if we'll wash our sins away in baptism and then live a faithful life for the rest of our days. Like, there's stipulations in both accounts, right? And so I just think it's interesting given the current of the religious world today. And so God has promised to save us, but there are stipulations in order to receive that free and unmerited gift from God. Their salvation was free and unmerited, but it still came with some strings attached. Same is true for our salvation. And so Paul urges them to take a meal and to eat. They had not eaten very much for 14 days. Paul says, tomorrow's the day, you're going to need your strength, so go ahead and eat. They eat. After they eat, they take the rest of the cargo, the wheat, the most important thing on the ship they're trying to get to Rome, and they throw it into the sea. Why would they do this? Lightning, right? What is normally around islands? Reefs, sandbars, and also the sand's getting shallower, right? And so you're trying to beach this thing. Like, you're trying to get some momentum behind you and bring it up on the beach. You want it as light as you possibly can. They could care less about people eating in Rome, right? This has become a life or death situation. Most people in the ancient world could not swim. right? And so, this is a big deal, getting as close to shore as possible. And so they lighten the load, they go and they try to do this. The Bible tells us that 275 men. Paul tells them they need to eat. What does Paul do with the food? Right? Romans did not pray before meals. This was a Hebrew custom that the Christians also do. And so I think about Paul saying a meal for 275 people, and I look at this and I think, this was something that Jews did. And even if Romans made fun of them for it, that's what they did. Now, Paul was on a ship with 275 other men, most of them being pagans. Does Paul feel intimidated to pray before his meal? Paul was in the middle of the ocean. He hasn't had food for 2 weeks. And what is this prayer? Is this, Lord, please save us tomorrow? Is that the prayer? What's the prayer? Thank you for this food. If Paul can say a prayer in front of pagans, thanking God for his food in public, then as Christians, we should be able to pray for our food in front of pagans and show God that we are thankful for the meals that we have. Because I guarantee you, we've all ate a lot better in this life than Paul did. And yet he prayed for every meal, right? And so as Christians, sometimes I know it can be, I'll be around people sometimes and they feel like it's odd to pray in public or something because they're not Christians here, and so Paul didn't care. Why should we care, right? In fact, it may be a good thing to show people that there are still people who are thankful for their daily meals. And so I'll stop preaching and continue on. So if you're not in the habit, please don't be an ungrateful pagan. Be a grateful Christian and pray for all the blessings God has given you, including the meals that you will eat here in a few short minutes. The Bible tells us they had dropped 4 Roman anchors. This is going to be important in the story a little bit later about what we're about to say. But these are 4 first century Roman anchors that have been found off the coast of Malta. Some people say they were all found in the same spot. And so people would say that these are the 4 anchors that were on Paul's ship that were cut at the same time and landed at the same time. They were found 90 feet away from the shoreline. Anybody know where the boat was when they dropped the anchors?
Pretty close to shore.
90 feet. Right? And so, are these the anchors of Paul's boat? I've got no clue. But if you go to the museum in Malta, you can see them, and it's still kind of neat. And so, land sighted. So let's go ahead and let's read, and we can finish up before we have to go. Maybe. Yeah. Oh, we already saw this, didn't we? No. So let's read verses 39 and following. Now, when it was day, they did not recognize the land, but they noticed a bay with a beach on which they planned, if possible, to run the ship ashore. So they cast off the anchors and let them on the sea. At the same time, loosening the ropes and tied the rudders, and hoisting the foresail with the wind, they made for the beach. But striking a reef, they ran the vessel aground, and the bow struck and remained immovable, and the stern was being broken up by the surf. And the soldiers' plan was to kill the prisoners, lest any should swim away and escape. But the centurion, wishing to save Paul, kept them from carrying out their plan, and he ordered those who could swim to jump overboard and first make to land, and the rest on planks or on pieces of the ship. And so all were brought safely to land. And so we can see here, they see the bay. This is known as St. Paul's Bay today. We'll talk a little bit more about that later, but they're 90 feet offshore. They cut the anchors, and they make a run for the beach. But a sandbar or a reef is the one that breaks the ship up. It gets caught, it gets broken. It's been estimated that the water is about 15 feet deep by the time the sandbar around this bay. And so they have now been driven 475 miles from Crete to Malta. And so they're almost 500 miles, and now they're just at the shoreline, and the boat breaks apart. And so the ship has endured 2 weeks of a typhoon. If it breaks anywhere before the beach, people are going to die, and yet it breaks when the water's 15 feet deep. Paul would say, the Bible tells us this is God's hand at work. And so the ship starts to break up. And what did the prisoners, or the soldiers decide to do with the prisoners? Kill them, right? We can't risk them getting away. But the centurion, because of his affection for Paul, saves them, and some swim and some ride into the ship. This is a picture of Malta. These are the two places that are disputed, these red marks you can see. The red dot on the north side, this is St. Paul's Bay. There's a church that was built there about 1,000 years ago, I guess. There's a church built there. This is called St. Paul's Bay. There has been some dispute as recently, though, whether or not it was this location or the location that you can see with the other red dot that's on that's the more southern point, known as St. Thomas's Bay. The 4 Roman anchors were found here at St. Thomas's Bay. Also, the landscape seems to fit more of the Acts narrative. And also, St. Paul's Bay was actually a harbor in the ancient world, so it would not make sense for them to be at the harbor and for them not to know where they were at if they were sailors of that area. But some have argued that maybe they just never went to Malta before. And so these are the two places you can see. If you go to Malta today, you can go to these two beaches, these two bays, and say, I've been where the Apostle Paul was shipwrecked and washed up on shore. So if you got any world travelers out there, maybe a cool trip. This is St. Paul's Bay that you can see today. Lots of resorts, very pretty island. This is St. Thomas's Bay. And so one of these two places more than likely is where the Apostle Paul was shipwrecked and washed up. So just kind of neat to think about Paul washing up on shore, those two places. Our takeaways, despite the circumstance, Paul's character remains true. And not only does his character remain firm, but people are attracted to that. Julius first sees it, but these 275 men, they're not Christians, they're not, except for Aristarchus and Luke, and yet Paul's character shines through, and then he's giving thanks for the meal for the entire ship of pagans. Number 2, faith despite circumstance. You never see Paul's faith waver at all during any of these circumstances. And so oftentimes in the midst of hardships, it's easy for our faith, if we're not careful, to wane or waver. But yet, time and time again, Paul has shown us that that doesn't need to be the case. And third, the historicity of Paul's travels, Luke's accuracy. One of the things that we didn't talk about is this is the most accurate depiction of a navigation of a Roman ship in the first century. The Bible, Acts 27, the best navigation that we have of any ship in the Roman world in the first century. Now, if we had found a papyrus in a cave or somewhere in the Baltic coast that had as much detail as what Paul gives us here, historians would lose their minds, right? But the greatest find of a decade. It's in Acts 27. Nobody bats an eye, right? But even people will tell you that as far as people who study navigation in the Roman world, this is by far the most detailed account of anything that we have, which is kind of cool. Any questions or comments before we close? Yeah, Luke was on the ship too. Luke and Aristarchus. Mm-hmm. So not only was Luke washed up there, but where Luke was washed up too. So, and Aristarchus. Good comment. Anyone else? No? All right. Well, let's go ahead and let's close with prayer. Thank you so much for your patience. I know that was a long chapter with a lot of detail, and looking forward to seeing you all tonight. Let's pray. Dear Heavenly Father, we're so thankful for this day and for all the many blessings you've given us. We're so thankful for the courage of men like Paul and Luke and Aristarchus that were willing to stand up and to preach your gospel, even if it meant being in chains and being put on a ship to be sent to a faraway land to stand trial. And dear Heavenly Father, we're thankful for the example of Paul's courage, even in the midst of difficult times on the ship there in the sea, being tossed to and fro. And we're also thankful for the courage that he had to take time in all that turmoil in front of those who do not have the same faith as him, to take time to pause and be thankful for what you have given him. And dear Heavenly Father, we pray that as Christians, you'll give us the same desire to take time to pause at different times of the day, before our meals, before we go to bed, and just to thank you for just the immense blessings that you have so lavishly given us that we have not deserved in the least. And dear Heavenly Father, please be with us and help us to always have a sense of gratitude for the blessings you've given us, and most importantly for the blessing of salvation through your Son. It's in His name we pray. Amen.